Hi, welcome to the Benburb Priory podcast. Benburb Priory is a place of peace, of vital history and Christian charity here in the heart of Ulster. We offer this podcast as an extension of our mission, so please check out our website, which is linked in the description below, and you can like and share and subscribe in order to support our ministry. If you wish to donate, then you can do that from August, and it'll help us to remain a hub for the community. In this episode of the Benburb Priory podcast, we're joined by Father Michael Ward. Father Michael is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford and a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. His principal research interest is in the theological imagination, with a focus on the thought and writings of our countryman, C.S. Lewis. We wanted to speak with him today then about his life and work in light of his exciting new book, which is After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man.
So to begin, Father Michael, can you please tell us a bit about your background and what first prompted your interest in C.S. Lewis?
Yes, so I'm an Englishman. I'm sorry to say that to you two Irish. Yeah, I was born and brought up in the south of England in Sussex, and born into a Christian family, an Anglican family. And some of my earliest memories are of me and my two older brothers jumping into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning. And my mum would read us a chapter or two of one of the Chronicles of Narnia. And then we'd all get up and have breakfast and go off to church. And that was a regular sort of routine on Sunday mornings. And some of my fondest childhood memories are of those occasions. And so I was exposed to the Narnia Chronicles and C.S. Lewis from a very early age, before I was even old enough to read them for myself. But when I was a bit older and able to read, I did so and went through all of Lewis's fiction and all of his Christian apologetics very keenly, very enthusiastically. And then I came here to Oxford to do my first degree in English. So I began to look at Lewis from a more scholarly point of view. And of course, he taught here at Oxford and was a scholar of English himself. I did a short undergraduate thesis on him at that point. And then after I graduated, I was asked to do a one-off lecture and a bit of tuition on Lewis. And I ended up living in his house for 3 years. So when it came time for me to do my own doctoral research, the obvious subject for my own PhD was C.S. Lewis, and without ever really planning it or being at all deliberate about it, C.S. Lewis has sort of accompanied me my whole life, and I now teach and speak and write about him for my living.
Wonderful. And regarding Lewis then, what formative role did his Irish background play in his later life and his own theological imagination?
Yes, he was born, of course, in Belfast in 1898, and he was baptised in St Mark's, Dundela. Is that how you say it? Dundela? Dundela? Dundela?
I think I would say the first one.
Yes,
Dundela, maybe. Not really sure.
Not sure for me.
Well, in that case, it can't matter very much. But anyway, St Mark's, Dundela. His grandfather, his mother's father, was the first rector of that parish. So Lewis was brought up in a Christian family and taken to church and taught all the normal things, he said. But when he was in his early teens, he abandoned his childhood faith and only came back to it in adulthood. But still, Ireland was, in Belfast, his upbringing was a very Christian upbringing, and I think one of the things we later see in Lewis's work as a Christian apologist is his desire to focus on what unites Christians. So he writes a book called Mere Christianity, which is all about the broad central mainstream of the Christian tradition. He's not interested in denominational divisions. He's not interested in what separates one tradition of Christianity from another. And I think that might be attributable to his upbringing in Belfast, which of course is a very sectarian community, or certainly was for much of Lewis's life. Thank God it's a lot better now than it used to be. But he saw how Christianity could get tangled up in social and political matters, and he wanted to steer clear of all that as much as he possibly could. So he was always very assiduous not to get into political matters or into Catholic versus Protestant sort of issues. And I think that is connected to his upbringing in Belfast. He loved his Irish roots and always regarded Belfast as home. I think he once said that his idea of heaven on earth would be if you could have picked up Oxford and placed it down in the green hills of County Down. So he was very fond of Ireland. He visited every year, even after he had moved to Oxford, and he had many happy hours of bathing in the waters of Donegal. That was his favourite holiday destination. And in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about how one of the sort of categories of thought that his imagination falls into, a division which is hard bitten into his mind, is one which he learnt from looking down into the loch of Belfast from his home, and seeing the great cranes and gantries and chimneys arising from the great shipyards, and the throb and stammer of Harland and Wolff putting together Titanic, and the other great ships that were built in that period. But beyond, he could see the Antrim Mountains, and that contrast between the smoke and the stir of the city life and the beautiful, enticing, romantically alluring distant vista. I think that contrast, he said, bit deep into his mind, and I think you can see that in some of his own works. I mean, he admits as much in his one of his novels, Out of the Silent Planet, has that sort of distinction between the low place and the high, the realm of air and the realm of ether, that sublunary, translunary divide, what you might call the realm of transience and impermanence, and indeed sin, the noise and the strife of city life, versus the peace and the calm of the heavenly realms. So that's one of the ways in which his own theological imagination was shaped by his upbringing in Belfast.
So unlike Lewis then, Father Michael, you eventually became Catholic. So can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yes, it was a decision that was 20 years in the making. So it's not something I can easily encapsulate now in just a couple of minutes. But I was, as I mentioned, born into an Anglican and very devout Anglican evangelical Christian family, and baptized and confirmed in that tradition. And indeed, I became an Anglican clergyman myself. I trained and was ordained within the Church of England. And after a long period of reflection, I came to a new appreciation of the constitutionality of the church. Let's call it that. By reflecting upon the incarnation, I came to a new awareness of the importance of time and place and social organization. If God becomes man, then that means that time and space and the body and human society matter. They're not irrelevant. But my own churchmanship, my own ecclesiology, my own doctrine of the church was very unincarnate. I tended to believe that the church was essentially a spiritual organization, almost a mystical one, without any identifiable headquarters or hierarchy or officers. But by beginning to think of the church more as the continuation or the perpetuation of the incarnation of Christ through time, through his apostles, through their teaching, I came to a conclusion that the only church I could properly be a member of was the Catholic Church. And so I had to resign my position as an Anglican clergyman, and I entered the Catholic Church in 2012 and was a happy layman for several years. And then after a period, I was encouraged by my parish priest to consider Catholic ordination. And so I then became a deacon and a priest in the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, which is that organisation especially brought about by Pope Benedict XVI to assist former Anglicans to become Catholic priests.
Wonderful. Thank you, Father Michael. And next, if we might take a look at some of your written work to whet our appetites for the forthcoming guide to the Abolition of Man. So if we might look back to Planet Narnia, the Seven Heavens and the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, what was the background for that book and the motivation?
Yeah, so Planet Narnia is my PhD thesis, basically. I mean, that may sound like an unreadably dense piece of academic prose, but hopefully I've made it fairly readable, and indeed the book has pictures. In the course of my researches into Lewis's theological imagination, I began to look at how he said things without saying them, his interest in implicit communication. And that led me to discover what he was really up to in the Narnia Chronicles. Lots of people have pointed out that the Narnia Chronicles seem a little bit disparate, a bit of a hodgepodge or a mishmash. Tolkien was the first person to object about the seeming discontinuities or inconsistencies in the mythological and literary traditions that Lewis draws upon in making the Narnia Chronicles. And some people have thought that probably Lewis just threw the books together. He was a professor at play, and that we shouldn't look too carefully or rigorously for any kind of imaginative scheme or coherence within the series. Despite that, quite a lot of other people have said, no, there must be something more binding them together, because Lewis wasn't a random or slapdash writer or thinker. He was a very rigorous and consistent thinker. So there must be something that's some scheme or some design that he's working to, even if we can't immediately see what it is. And all sorts of different theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins or the 7 sacraments, or any 7 that people can think of, really. But remarkably, the one 7, which is all over Lewis's works, and which nobody had considered until I came along, is the 7 heavens, the 7 planets of the medieval cosmos. And when you come at Narnia from that perspective, all sorts of things fall into place with a most satisfying click. And the whole series, I believe, springs into focus in a beautiful and sophisticated fashion.
And why do you think, why did Lewis describe the 7 heavens as spiritual symbols of permanent value and especially worthwhile in our own generation?
Yes, well, quite. Why did he? Most people don't even know what the 7 heavens are anymore, but Lewis did. He studied the 7 heavens of the medieval cosmos very closely as a medieval scholar. The 7 heavens are the planets from which we get the names of the days of the week. That's the best way to think about them. So, Saturday is called Saturday because it's named after Saturn. Sunday is named after the sun. Monday after the moon. And the other 4 days of the week, if you think in French or Spanish, it's a bit more obvious. Mars's day, Mercury's day, Jove's day, Jupiter's day, and Venus's day. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. For some reason in English, we use the Norse names rather than the Roman names for the relevant planetary gods. But those are the 7 heavens, and Lewis described them, yes, as you say, as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And why did he say that? Well, partly because we need an understanding of these 7 spiritual symbols if we're to understand medieval poetry. Dante, for instance, and Chaucer use these 7 heavens all over the place. And so Lewis wanted to keep an awareness of these 7 heavens alive in the minds of his readers and students. But it's not just a historical curiosity. He says they are especially worthwhile in our own generation, because Lewis's generation, of course, was the generation that went through the First World War. He himself had been a teenage officer in the British Army during the Great War, and he had seen men die. He'd been very nearly killed himself. Nearly 750,000 British servicemen were killed in that conflict. And that's why he says of Saturn, we know more than enough. Of Saturn, we know more than enough. Saturn being associated in medieval thought with death and disaster and calamity. But who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter, of the kingly symbol, of the regal and magnanimous and tranquil and festive monarchical symbol? If we are tempted to think of the universe as Saturnocentric, as he puts it, dominated by Saturnine influences and all these qualities of death and disaster, as would be a very natural conclusion to draw in his generation, well, we should think again. And this is one of the benefits of the seven heavens, that if ever you're inclined to think that there's only one way of interpreting spiritual reality, remember there are another six. There's this whole spectrum. It's like the seven colours of the rainbow. Each one provides you with a lens or a prism through which you can see reality. Saturn is not the only one, nor the best. Rather, Jupiter is the king of the heavens, and that's why when Lewis came to write what has become his most famous work, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he constructs that chronicle out of the symbolism of Jupiter, so that he admits us to a jovial world. The whole of that story is constructed out of this kingly symbol. Jupiter is the planet that brings about winter past and guilt forgiven. And that's, if you like, a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, I could go on at great length, but that's probably enough to give your listeners a taste of why he thought these spiritual symbols were so important.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Father Michael. And then why did Lewis keep this imaginative blueprint a secret?
Yes, very good question. Of course, he could be secretive. He remember, he got married in his late 50s and kept his marriage secret. Have you seen the film Shadowlands? Do you know about this aspect of his life?
Yeah.
He marries this American woman, Joy Davidman, secretly. Nobody was told about it, not even close friends like Tolkien. Now, a man who can keep his marriage secret can easily keep secret a literary structuring device. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many things that one of his friends jokingly said it should have been called Suppressed by Jack. Surprised by Joy. Jack, of course, was Lewis's nickname. So he could be secretive. But why would he be secretive about this? Well, it's because he's wanting to communicate to us below the radar. This is why I talked about why my research set out to explore implicit communication, saying things without saying them. So he's admitting us to the jovial symbol in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Aslan is the king. Winter passes. Guilt is forgiven. The jovial Father Christmas turns up. All these jovial archetypes and elements are hardwired into that Narnian story, but we're not asked to identify them as such. We're not asked to look at them, to contemplate them from the outside. Rather, we're asked to inhabit them, to participate in them, to feel them, to look along them, to use one of Lewis's favourite terms. Looking along a beam of light is very different from looking at a beam of light. And looking along, enjoyment consciousness, as he calls it, is the profounder mode of knowledge, the deeper kind of consciousness. It's the kind of, to use a French verb, it's the connaître kind of knowledge, as opposed to the savoir. You can know about things from the outside, and that's all well and good, but the deeper kind of knowledge is the knowledge by acquaintance, the knowledge from inside. Now, if Lewis had told us that he was deliberately constructing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe out of Jupiter symbolism, everybody would immediately have, as it were, extracted themselves from the story and tried to identify all these allegorical elements, and the whole purpose would have been defeated. So he had to keep it secret. if he told people, it would have frustrated the very thing he was trying to achieve.
And Father Michael, if we can talk about the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, what brought this volume into existence? And can you tell us a little bit about the international team of scholars surveying Lewis's career, as a literary historian, popular theologian, and creative writer?
Yeah, so this is the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, which I helped edit along with my friend Robert McSwain. And it was really him, Robert McSwain, who came up with the idea that we should go in together on a project, because this Cambridge Companion series, there are Cambridge Companions to everybody and everything, but there wasn't yet one to C.S. Lewis. And he thought it was time to change that. So we put together a proposal, and Cambridge University Press said, "Oh, thank you. Yes, various other people have put this idea to us before, but we've never liked their lineup. But we like what you've suggested, so they commissioned us to do it." And so we got together, this team of international scholars and experts, and we divided up Lewis's output into 3 parts: scholar, thinker, writer. So his academic output as a medieval literary critic, literary historian. Thinker means everything else, which is sort of academic but not professional. And then writer, of course, is his creative side, his fiction and his poetry. I myself contributed an essay on his approach to suffering. There are essays on scripture. That's a very good one by Kevin Van Hooser. His background in the classics has an essay on it. That's been much overlooked. And 21 chapters in all. So almost anything that you care to want to know about C.S. Lewis is covered by someone in this volume, I hope.
Yeah, wonderful. And then as you just hit upon there, what are some of your preferred takes on Lewis by others from, say, theological, philosophical, or even literary perspectives, and why do they captivate you so much?
Yes, there's so much scholarship on C.S. Lewis. It's hard almost to keep up with it. But some of my favourite works are, within this volume, Malcolm Guite has a fine essay on Lewis's poetry. That's another much overlooked aspect of Lewis's output. But Lewis had always wanted to be a poet. That was his great ambition from an early age. And indeed, his first 2 publications were volumes of poetry. Before he was 30, he'd had 2 volumes of poetry published. But they didn't do very well. They didn't make much of an impact critically. They weren't at all a commercial success. So he eventually abandoned that idea. But he continued to write poetry, and he certainly had great poetic gifts. He knew how to use language. He knew how to create metaphors. And those poetic gifts we see eventually in his prose, and I think in his less well-known but still important verse. And so Malcolm Guite surveys the whole of his career as a poet, as a versifier, and that's, I think, a really, really good essay. What else is in, just keeping to this volume? Well, Stanley Hauerwas has a very interesting essay on Lewis and violence. Now, Stanley Hauerwas is a pacifist, of course, and Lewis was not a pacifist. So there's a nice sort of locking of horns between the author of that essay and the subject of the essay, which makes the sparks fly in very interesting and, I think, illuminating ways. And then Gilbert Mylander on Lewis's moral knowledge. That's a fine piece of work, and we'll perhaps come back to that when we talk about my forthcoming book on the abolition of man.
And just before we go to that, if we could talk about C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner. On the 50th anniversary of his death, C.S. Lewis was memorialised in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey, taking his place beside the greatest names in English literature. So this volume gathers addresses from those events. And what do you hope readers will take away from this book, Father Michael?
Yes, thank you for advertising that too. Here it is, C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner, which I edited with Peter Williams. And so in 2013, it was the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. He died, of course, on the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. And 50 years later, it fell to me as perhaps the greatest honour and privilege of my life to unveil the memorial. I had the job of pulling the curtain back, as it were, and there in the pavement of Poets' Corner now is this memorial to Lewis. And the inscription on the stone runs like this: "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And that quotation we selected because it seems to encapsulate so much of Lewis's interests and preoccupations. He was a great Christian apologist, he was a great Christian scholar, he was a great Christian poet and writer, but he wasn't just always hammering on about religious matters, Christian doctrine, churchy stuff. He was interested in everything. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Christianity illuminated the whole world and the cosmos and things beyond the cosmos as far as Lewis was concerned. We have more biographical chapters. Pretty much everything is covered. And that's one thing I hope people will take away from it. Another is that, so much of the scholarship on Lewis has been done by Americans. Nothing against Americans, of course, in saying that, but it would be nice if British people took him to their hearts a bit more. And in this volume, we see that happening because nearly all the contributors are British, and they certainly, and all these commemorative events happened in Britain, in Westminster and in Oxford and Cambridge. And I know that there were some events that took place in Belfast as well, but we didn't get those into the covers of this book, I'm afraid. A prophet is not without honour save in his own country. So the scriptural verse has it. And there's been some truth about that, I think, with regard to C.S. Lewis, that because he's one of us, he can't be important, can he? Because he's a little bit too close to the knuckle. He's speaking truth to power. He's telling it like it is, and so we rather have cold-shouldered him, or relatively speaking, cold-shouldered him alongside American reactions, for instance. But at last, in 2013 and since, I think he has, as it were, come back into the British fold, and we've acknowledged, actually, no, this brother of ours, this son of ours, is one of the greats. He's one of the towering figures of the 20th century, and he deserves to be honoured and richly honoured in his home country.
Amen to all of that, Father Michael. And one of the contributors to that was the late Walter Hooper, Lewis's editor and biography. How important was he to the field of Lewis studies, and how has he aided your own work then?
Yes, Walter Hooper was hugely, hugely important. God rest his soul. He died just the end of last year, in December 2020. And I had a privilege of preaching the homily at his Requiem Mass in Oxford. So I knew him for 30 years and more, and he himself had known C.S. Lewis at the end of Lewis's life. He'd been Lewis's secretary briefly for a few months just before Lewis died. Died unexpectedly. Walter Hooper had hoped that this would be the beginning of a long relationship. And indeed it was the beginning of a long relationship, except, alas, Lewis had gone to his reward within a few months of their first meeting. So the relationship turned into one of being Lewis's editor and biographer, and curating the whole legacy of C.S. Lewis. And that's what Walter Hooper spent his the rest of his life doing, and doing very well and very thoroughly and assiduously. So almost all the posthumous collections of Lewis's works that you may come across, his letters, his diaries, the short essays and articles and sermons and so on, nearly all those volumes were edited and put together by Walter Hooper, which was especially important in the early years after Lewis's death, because typically after an author dies, his works do gradually fall out of print and people tend to forget. But Walter kept Lewis's name before the public by bringing out all these new editions and volumes, and indeed in co-authoring the first biography of Lewis with Roger Lancelyn Green. So he was absolutely crucial, I think, in perpetuating Lewis's reputation, and not just perpetuating it, but building it, increasing it, amplifying it, introducing us to all sorts of things which would otherwise have been lost or never known about.
And Father Michael, if we could just turn to After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So After Humanity is a guide to one of C.S. Lewis's most widely admired, but probably one of his least accessible works. First of all, can you just remind us of what The Abolition of Man is about, if you would?
Yeah, The Abolition of Man is a difficult work, though a very important work. And it originated as a series of philosophical lectures that Lewis gave during the Second World War, lectures about the objectivity of value, whether right and wrong, good and evil are things objectively out there in the universe that we recognize, that we discover are that way and could be no other way, or is objective value something we make up, something we just project upon reality according to our own private preferences, our own subjective whims, our own desires or appetites. And Lewis's argument is that value is objective, and indeed we have to assume this. It's self-evident. If we try to step outside the idea of objective value and begin to try to create values from, whole cloth, as it were, we'll have no grounds for doing anything. It's a premise that value is objective, that there is this ecology of goodness that we live within. We breathe it in with our mother's milk, as it were. And we can't imagine, or at least we can't successfully imagine, a moral universe which is any other way. Even those people who say that value is subjective, that we're just making it all up, if you press them, pretty soon, or sooner or later, they'll say, well, no, this is just good. It's not because I say it's good, it's just good. And that's basically his argument, which sounds rather unexceptional and rather, almost platitudinous. But then Lewis's whole point is that this is such a central and foundational point that if we're not careful, we take it for granted, and things we take for granted, we may not respect properly. We may allow to be, as it were, questioned improperly by the subjectivists. So there's a case for defending, the ground that we're standing on. It's a fairly obvious undertaking, but necessary, because the moral situation in the 20th century had become so dire, and indeed has only become direr since Lewis wrote. I'm sure he would have been appalled by some of the developments in ethics that have occurred since his death. So anyway, that's what The Abolition of Man is about, the objectivity of value. But these three lectures are difficult, they're dense, uncharacteristically hard to understand for C.S. Lewis, who was usually a very lucid and accessible writer.
Then why do you think, Father Michael, that Lewis characterized The Abolition of Man as almost my favorite among my books, and why has his biographer, Walter Hooper, whom you mentioned, called it an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewisiana?
Yes, Lewis did say that The Abolition of Man was almost my favourite among my books. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for readers of Lewis to understand it and to get to grips with it. But why was it so favoured by him? Well, I think from a biographical point of view, from a personal point of view, Lewis himself had struggled with subjectivism personally. He'd been tempted by it, as it were. He'd seen it as a genuine opponent that he had to meet and fight and eventually beat. He says this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that in his early years, his mind was torn. The two hemispheres of his brain were in sharpest opposition with each other. That he knew what it was to face a world of facts without one trace of value, but he also knew what it was to face a world of feelings without one trace of truth or falsehood. And this bifurcation, this polarization, he felt was, destroying his integrity as a human being. And it was overcoming that polarity, finding an integration, finding a resolution that showed him how important it was that value was objective. And not only was it important, but it was demonstrable. You could argue, you could defend it, because he had done that in his own thinking, personally, privately. So having done that in his own life, having gone through this existential angst, as it were, he was keen to share it with other people. And so from an early point in his academic career, we find him talking about the objectivity of value long before he was a theist or a Christian. So The Abolition of Man is a purely philosophical work. It's not a Christian piece of apologetics. It's not even depending upon a belief in God. Rather, he's saying that it's what makes us human that we acknowledge the objectivity of value. You can only be a Christian if you're a human being first. And what is it that makes us human? It is this acknowledgement of objective good and evil, of objective right and wrong. Deny that, and you bring about the abolition of man, hence the title of the piece. So it's a kind of anthropological claim that he's making. That this is what makes us human. This is what makes us man, as opposed to animal. So that's one personal reason why he favoured it. And another is more to do with his own output as a writer and thinker, that The Abolition of Man is like the distillation of ideas which occur in many of his other writings, but less focused, less condensed. Or you might put it the other way around and say that The Abolition of Man is the kernel, the acorn out of which grew so many of his other books. So Mere Christianity, for instance, look at the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity, and you'll see a very popular, much more accessible defense of the objectivity of value. Or look at That Hideous Strength, one of his novels. That's the fictional counterpart to The Abolition of Man. Lewis says as much. So a lot of his other writings are either reframing the abolition of man, or expanding it, or building upon it, or retelling it in various ways. Those are some of the reasons why it was so important to him.
And how does this resolutely philosophical thesis then fit in with his other more explicitly Christian works, Father Michael?
Yes, well, good question. It has to do with his belief in common grace, the importance of natural theology. There are 2 main ways of doing theology: natural theology and revealed theology. So revealed theology, of course, is direct communication from the divine through the prophets, through the scriptures, and obviously absolutely centrally and foundationally for a Christian, through Jesus Christ himself. That's revelation. But there's also natural theology by means of looking at creation, looking at the things that have been made, looking at our own human nature, trying to work out, through the exercise of our own conscience, what it means to have been made as we have been made. And so St. Paul in the letter to the Romans can talk about how many of the attributes of God, his invisible qualities, are discernible from things that have been made. That's natural theology. And so the Abolition of Man is if you like, a work of natural theology. It's just talking about conscience and morality, good and evil. If you press it, if you go further, you will find that Lewis's philosophy fits within his larger theology, but they're not at all in conflict. They're totally compatible. It's just in the Abolition of Man, he's setting his sights very low. He's trying to keep things, as it were, neutral, so that all people of goodwill can settle upon this minimum definition of what it means to be human. And that's why in the appendix to the Abolition of Man, he has a long list of moral duties and moral laws derived from cultures and civilizations and traditions from all over the world, not just Christian ones, not let alone Judeo-Christian ones, but Native American, Babylonian, ancient Egyptian, Norse, Hindu, Australian Aboriginal. He's drawing upon all these different traditions to show that people across the world and down through the generations have all had a very largely similar view on what constitutes good and evil, right and wrong. And that's testimony to the foundational innate identity that we have as moral beings.
Marvelous, thank you, Father Michael. And what new light do you then hope to shed on this important but difficult work regarding both its general academic context and indeed the circumstances in Lewis's own life, and how that helped to give rise to it?
Yeah, so, well, here's the book. After Humanity, which has just come out. I've only had this for 2 days. It hasn't yet been released upon the wider world. It comes out on June the 23rd officially. So what I tried to do in this book is, well, give the general background context, of course, give the history, give the context. But then the major part of the book is a long, detailed commentary and gloss, going through the Abolition of Man almost line by line, word by word, explaining all the difficult terms, the Latin phrases, the Greek and the French phrases, which he sprinkles liberally across the text. I explain his references to, who's Traherne, for instance. He just drops that name in. Who are Gaius and Titius? He invents these names of Gaius and Titius, but he never explains who Gaius and Titius were. And I've discovered who they were. They were real people, and I've found photographs of them and managed to put those photographs in the book. So there's a whole photo gallery of glorious Technicolor images, which hopefully, make Lewis's philosophical work a bit more appealing and interesting, including these images of Lewis as a soldier, because he, as I mentioned, had fought in the First World War. But one of the things about the Abolition of Man, he argues, is that the crucial test of the objectivity of value is death for a good cause. Laying down one's life for one's friends is not of immediate personal advantage to the person who's sacrificing himself, but that doesn't mean it's not good. On the contrary, that's the crucial test of the objectivity of value. Now, it's often been remarked that if you want to understand a figure from the past, a useful question to ask is, what was going on in that person's life when he turned 20? And when Lewis turned 20, the Great War was coming to an end. Indeed, the armistice was signed almost on his birthday when he turned 20. But he had also just lost his great friend Paddy More, a fellow Irishman. And this is the first time that this photograph of both men, Lewis and More, has ever been published, with them both identified. So that's another selling point of the book, I hope. But when Paddy More, his friend, died in the First World War, Lewis's whole life course was changed, because he had promised his friend that if the worst should happen, Lewis, would look after Paddy's mother and sister. And Lewis kept his promise and lived with these two women for the next 30 years. Absolutely changed the course of his life. So when he comes to write The Abolition of Man and is reflecting upon how it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, you know, that old Latin tag, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which he finds in the Roman poet Horace, Lewis is not just, you know, expatiating philosophically on abstract matters which are just purely cerebral for him. On the contrary, he's talking about something which directly concerned the entire course of his life, that his buddy, Paddy, had died for his country. Was Paddy's death in vain? Could it possibly have some objective value? And so The Abolition of Man is a deeply personally felt argument. Not that Lewis ever obtrudes his own personal experience onto the pages. It's all, you know, very at arm's length. But nonetheless, if you understand the background, then you begin to see why The Abolition of Man was so important to C.S. Lewis, but also why it's become so influential. And it has been very influential and much admired by people all across the spectrum, atheists, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, everyone in between. It's had a long legacy in ethical philosophy, even though it is a challenging work. And I think that springs from the fact that it's brought out of a deep place in Lewis's own life. And that's one of the things I try to bring out in this guide.
Fantastic, Father Michael. And where can viewers get the new book and follow you and your work?
Yeah, so the book is published by Word on Fire Academic, a new imprint of the Word on Fire ministry of Bishop Robert Barron. The first volume in this new academic line was a book about Tolkien, and mine is the second title. So if you go to wordonfire.org/humanity, wordonfire.org/humanity, you'll find all the details about the book and how to buy it. And indeed, you'll get, if you buy it through the publisher's website, you automatically get a free copy of The Abolition of Man with a tie-in cover. They've been specially designed as a pair. And if you want to find out more about me, michaelward.net is my website.
Magnificent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Father Michael, and for those of you watching at home. And God bless you, Father Michael.
And you. Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks, Daniel.
Yes.
Again, for anyone watching, remember to like, to share and subscribe. You can support the Priory. From August onwards, you'll be able to donate if you wish, and you can give us, of course, a visit in person. You can avail from the Servite hospitality. You can enjoy our museum, the library, the castle, and there's a beautiful valley park. So God bless you. Thank you again, Father Michael, and Daniel too.
Thanks.